Hello there, I am today going to be talking you through a good strategy for approaching a comparison essay question. Now this is going to link specifically to the Year 9 War module that we study towards the end of the spring-summer term. So by this point hopefully you would have had a really good understanding of a range of poems, all presenting war in slightly different ways. And as you were kind of progressing with reading the poems, I'm sure you may have been thinking about some poems that were similar in some of the ideas that they were presenting, and some actually that were very different. So this gives you an opportunity to really showcase your opinions on the poem, confirm how you understand them, and also to be able to make higher, more evaluative comments about them. Because at this point, as we're kind of stepping into Year 10 and GCSE soon, it's really good to get to know a way of answering this question, because this is something that you will be likely to see come Year 10 and 11. And this is an approach that you could also adopt for that. There are lots of different ways of doing these comparison questions. However, in my mind, this is how I would put it simply and still be able to achieve really good results. Okay, so the question that we're going to be focusing on today is compare how war is presented in Dulce et Decorum Est and one other poem. Now this is exactly like the sort of format that you would get come GCSE, so there'll be one poem that is already presented to you out of the collection, and then you'll need to compare it to another of your choice. Now with any essay question, the first thing that you should do is think about what the keywords are in the question. So you know that this is a comparison question, so we're going to have to be making references back and forth across the poems. But the main crux of this question is around this: compare how war is presented. So at the back of my mind, I always need to think to myself, am I answering the question? Am I declaring my own views about how war is presented? So in terms of what I think your essay should visually look like, it would be something like this. So first of all, you'd introduce what the question is, who the poets are in the poems, and ultimately how they're presenting war. After that, you'd then present the first poem, and in this instance the poem is Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, and we're going to in a moment consider how war is presented in that poem. Then you make a connection on to the second poem, which is one of your choice. And for the purposes of this example, and what I would suggest with my own class, is that we compare it with Rupert Brooke's The Soldier. And the reason I've chosen that is because it is definitely contrasting to Dulce et Decorum Est, because it celebrates war, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now what I've done here is I've done two arrows linking back. So the reason for that is because the way that you're going to be answering this part of the question about comparing the works is by using these types of words. So whilst The Soldier presents war in this way, we see that differently in Dulce et Decorum Est, because you could also say by comparison, Dulce et Decorum Est does it like this, whereas The Soldier does it like this. Or both The Soldier and Dulce et Decorum Est present the view that, and then you'd go on to that. So it's these words that you really need to get a grasp of and under your belt in order to make convincing links back and forth and answering the question really. Then finally you come on to your conclusion, and by now your conclusion you should be familiar with is ultimately saying, what do you think are the writer's intentions for presenting war? Why in your opinion are they doing that? And ultimately just kind of re-summarising what your own opinions were on those poems. So let's just take a step back then. As I said, this is my key focus point. How is war presented? So I'm now going to think about here exactly what I can write for this section and brainstorm a few ideas. Now for me, I think the war presented in Dulce et Decorum Est is seen to be very brutal. I think it's seen to be a harsh reality. I think it's seen to be very traumatic because of all the events that these soldiers have to witness. And I also think it conveys some of the physical suffering that is experienced and endured by these soldiers. As we know, they're being compared to beggars, almost like old hags being bent over because they're just so exhausted from the physical effects of war. But obviously we know that the soldier presents a very different view of this, and Rupert Brooke is actually trying to celebrate war. So I'm going to write that. So how is war presented then? Well, war is presented in a celebratory way, in a way that is intended to celebrate. We know that this is a propaganda poem in order to try and rally more men to go and fight. And we can also say that Brooke glorifies war. So he makes war seem like this sort of heroic and important act, and this idea that if you don't go ahead and you don't do it, then you're not going to be remembered in the right way. So we can see that they're very contrasting. So that's going to give us lots to talk about in terms of these. By contrast, comparatively, by comparison, however, whilst. I don't think we're going to be saying that both of them had the same view. Yeah, we're not going to be saying, well, both the soldier and Dulce et Decorum Est present a glorified view of war, because they don't. So therefore we'd be saying the soldier, by contrast, conveys a celebratory view of war when compared with Dulce et Decorum Est. So these are your key words. That's how you're going to do it. So now I'm going to talk you through step by step a way of sort of preparing and planning your question. So the first step is to think about the introduction. Now the introduction can often go wrong quite quickly because information is thrown into it that doesn't really need to be there. So words such as this is going to be shown through language, structure and form. Now I would really go against doing that because it's kind of obvious that we're going to be answering and examining those features anyway. So therefore these are some of the things that I suggest you think about. So the first thing is about, obviously we need to introduce the poets and the poems and ultimately what question we're answering. So you'd be saying Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est and Rupert Brooke's The Soldier present their varying views about the presentation of war. And then you'd be exactly saying, well, overall, what are they suggesting about war? And as we've said here in these key words, you'd be saying, well, Dulce et Decorum Est presents a brutal and harsh reality of war, whilst, key word there, whilst the soldier introduces a more celebratory tone and kind of emphasises that the soldiers are heroes. So I'm going to say heroic in there as well. So all of the amount of keywords that you get here, build a big list of them because you will always be referring to them, because where I see some students' work kind of fall down a bit is they only perhaps will have one of these words to say. So then in the paragraph it becomes a case of saying Dulce et Decorum Est presents a very brutal view of war. We see this in the quotation blah 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 blah. This presents a brutal view of war because it could be brutal because blah 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 blah. So we want to have a range of these keywords. So what are they suggesting about war? And then finally, how is each poem comparing with the other? Is it that they have ultimate contrasts, or actually are they quite similar in what they're arguing? And I think we've already established that the message in both of these poems is very contradictory. So move on to step 2. So step 2 then is about finding the relevant quotations and looking over the notes and annotations in your own poems. So what I've got here is an example of what that looks like. So for me, I've picked out a key quote in Dulce Decorum Est of bent double like old beggars under sacks. And it's really important that I really zoom in on these keywords and some of the writer's techniques. So, bent double like old beggars under sacks. Now I'm interested in all of these words, to be honest, but the technique that I'm first of all noticing is that this is a simile. So we're comparing the soldiers with old beggars. But it's no good just saying, oh, okay, well, I can see a simile here. We need to be arguing why that simile is being used and what the effect of that simile is. So one of my key things I want you to think about every time you are examining some language, and why. Why is that word interesting? Why is that technique interesting? So the simile here is interesting because we would usually associate soldiers with being kind of physically strong, mentally and physically. We'd probably expect them to be prepared. But in this case, Owen is actually presenting them as beggars, as though they are physically incapable of going to war, as though they are almost in poverty because they don't even have the right equipment to prepare them for this. So in doing that, I've already zoomed in on a simile, I've zoomed in on the word beggars and why that's interesting, and I'm also going to zoom in on the word old, because the irony is that the men who lost their lives were incredibly young. And it kind of reminds me of a time myself when I saw a big memorial and graveyard in France, and I was struck by just how young 15, 16, 17-year-old these men were that lost their lives so young. So that could be another word that I can zoom in on. So everything about this quote here shows how physically exhausted and how much they are struggling and how incapable these men really are. But if we look at this quotation, so this is from the soldier, there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. So this idea that even the foreign field belongs to England. So this idea that we are, it presents a very patriotic tone, because this idea that England is being personified. We've got the word that is forever England, so it's this idea that that the soldier is never going to be separated from the homeland or the motherland, and therefore there's always going to be this connection with home, and therefore they're always going to go down in history for serving their own lives. A foreign field. So even though these men are being killed or buried in some distant land, there's that kind of familiarity, because actually they're always going to be remembered by the English people. So as you can see there, I haven't necessarily referred to a technique because I don't think it's necessary for this quotation, and that's fine, but as long as you are making sure that you're zooming in on some of the words and why they've been used, what is the overall effect. You'll notice as well here that I've used this slash. Now that's not because it was in the poem, but it's because within the poem that the field was at the end of the line, this came underneath it, so I'm just revealing that I know that there is this separation in line. So it's just because the ending of poems is also really important. So finally then, well, penultimately, step 3, planning your response. Now the amount of students that argue that you don't need to plan, you can just get writing, I will tell you adamantly that you have to plan if you want your essay to really hold up and be clear, coherent and well written. And there's also different ways of doing it. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to show you how I kind of bullet point it, but in other references sometimes I'll do kind of a big mind map or spider diagram, with some of my classes, but for this reason I'm just going to talk you through what these arrows and symbols mean to me. So it's kind of the more practice you get with this, the more you'll develop your own style. So imagining then that I'm looking at this part of my structure, so Dulce Decorum Est, this big paragraph, I'm notifying to myself that I need to say how it's presenting war. So Dulce Decorum Est, as I've said before, presents a brutal, sort of traumatic and realistic view of war. And I'd literally leave it there in terms of the first sentence of my paragraph. I've introduced a quotation here that I think emphasise that, like I've already talked through before. So I'd be saying, Dulce Decorum Est presents a brutal, traumatic and realistic view of war. This is particularly emphasised in the quotation, bent double like old beggars under sacks. Now this simile here is ironic because you would expect the soldiers to be strong, prepared for war, but actually they're being compared to beggars, which gives the overall idea that they are exhausted, that they're poor because they don't have the correct equipment, and how incapable they are at being able to fight this war. So you can see there that the annotations and the notes do it all for you. Your planning is just really about getting those ideas down. Then you say, well, this reveals that X, Y, Z, as I've kind of already gone through, but you want to really show off that you know more about this poem, because you don't just note one quotation that emphasises this brutal perspective of war. I've got another one. So furthermore, we've got the quotation, all went lame, all blind, and in the same sort of fashion as I would have done before, I'd have really zoomed in on some of the words. So this repetition of all, this isn't just one soldier that's struggling, it's a unanimous and huge amount that are feeling this way. They went lame and blind, so they are kind of physically struggling, they're physically inept, they can't actually go ahead and fight this war because they can't, they have these limitations. So the same again, I would say, this conveys XYZ about war according to Owen. And these can be as detailed and as thorough as you want them to be. So then we're moving on to our second paragraph here. These are going to be quite chunky paragraphs. So I'd be saying, well, by contrast, the soldier presents a celebratory perspective of war, as the poem actually functions as a form of propaganda intended to inspire more people to go and fight in war. So that would be my very first sentence. Same again, I'd think about this quotation I've already examined and looked at, and some of the close analysis, and always thinking why, which I would kind of say there, and what that betrays about war. And same again, I would show off more quotations that I know about the poem. So here I'd say, well, Brooke also declares about war that if somebody dies, then they're going to be remembered under an English heaven, and therefore I'd suggest what that reveals, which is in contrast to Owen, who says this, this and this. So as I get on to my conclusion, I'm saying that ultimately I believe that the writer's intentions are this for Dulce Decorum Est, and that they are this for the soldier. Ultimately, this presents varying perspectives of war, and the reasons for this might be X, Y, and Z. So your final step then, as I would suggest here, is to begin writing this up, really using all the notes and understanding from your plan, and that final step of proofreading your work, just making sure that the sentences aren't too long, making sure that at all times you're questioning why certain things are being used, and above all, making sure that you answer the question.